This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this week's episode, where I'm talking water-wise gardening with Janet Manning. Janet undertook a 3-year project with the RHS and Cranfield University, where she looked at strategies and techniques currently available to gardeners to help them both conserve and manage water in a way that reduces waste and protects the environment. We talk about why there's a need to be water-wise in wet countries like the UK, what we can do to help, and why gardens are an important part of the bigger environmental picture. Janet starts out by talking about her role in the project.
Yes, absolutely. So I've just finished the KTP project with Cranfield and the RHS. KTP stands for Knowledge Transfer Partnership. So it was all about transferring the academic knowledge from Cranfield to help the RHS develop their water management planning. And I think we've fairly successfully done that, but we've also done an awful lot to actually transfer that knowledge out to the gardening public as well. And the most recent, the culmination of the project, if you like, was two main things. Was the website called Mains to Rains, which helps gardeners understand how they can switch to using much more rainwater in their gardens. It's free and it falls out of the sky regularly, as we all know in England. So, it's there for us to use, and it's much more sensible to use that than the mains water. Lots of ideas on that website. And also to display all of those features to the visitors Chelsea Flower Show. We took that display to Chelsea in September this year. So, that was sort of the culmination of what gardeners in general would have seen, but there was an awful lot more going on in the background at the RHS themselves.
And what's your background? How did you get involved with the project?
Well, that's an interesting one. So I've always gardened. I've gardened ever since I was big enough to pick up a small spade or shovel. But my first career was in the water industry. So I spent 17 years working in Wessex Water as a scientist, helping to keep all the pollutants that we often hear about out of the water so that it's all safe for drinking and keeping everybody safe. And then I had 3 children, so that sort of put a stop to that career, really. And I decided that once the children were growing up, I was going to just enjoy doing some gardening. And I went to work at my local garden centre, fitted perfectly around the kids. But unfortunately, that was a small, independently run garden centre, and it was lovely. It was great 5 years I spent there, actually watering plants and actually selling them to the public. But then they decided to retire and sell the nursery, and so I just started looking around for other work, and up popped this advert for a scientist working with Cranfield University, working with the RHS to help gardeners use water better in the gardens. And I thought, I'd tick enough boxes for that for an interview. Maybe I'll get a free day out at Wisley. I've never been to Wisley. I never thought for 1 minute that I would actually get the job, but there we go.
Wow. Well, that was a result. So, we talk about conserving water in gardens. It is an ongoing conversation for gardeners. What are the kind of main things that gardeners can do to conserve water within their own back gardens?
Well, this is where I've tried to sort of change the language slightly. We talk an awful lot about saving water, and I'm sure we can, but it's not quite as simple as just saving water. It's about managing water. If we think about the way the climate is changing, we're going to see more extremes. So we're going to see longer, hotter, dry spells, but we're also going to see really longer, heavier rainfall that's going to cause flooding, more surface water, and that in itself can cause equally as many problems. And so it's trying to manage that situation so that, it doesn't take much when you think about things in a circle. If you can just hang on to some of that excess water when it's about and then use it during those dry spells, everybody benefits. So it's not necessarily about just saving water, although I'm sure we all can. It's about managing the water that's there when it is there so that you can use it when it's not there. But yes, there's loads of things that you can do in your own garden. The most instant and obvious thing that everybody thinks of is water butts. Great. If you're not using one, or if you've got one and you're not using one, which is even worse, then please do use your water butts. They help to collect all the rain that comes off of your roof. Is more than enough to help with an awful lot of your gardening needs. And there's lots of ways you can add water butts to your garden. You don't necessarily have to put them in the spot where the downpipe comes down off the roof. There's other ways that you can move water around the garden using siphons. There's loads of different ways.
Yeah, so actually the conserving water was the first part of my question. The second bit was, how can gardeners contribute towards rainwater management? So obviously using water butts is one of the things, and I'm sure, like you say, there are so many things that can be done. What are the most important ones in your opinion that people can do to manage water more effectively?
So I think the one that a lot of people sort of forget about is that if you think about the natural world doesn't have water butts, but it does have deep, organic, healthy soils. And that's where we can store lots and lots of water. So by adding organic matter to your soils, by not digging it, by keeping that open structure through, having healthy soils with lots of organic matter in, then that helps to retain the rain when it does come. It helps the rain infiltrate down through the soil. That recharges the groundwater, and with the plants growing in it, they also then actually take away the nutrients from it. So the water that does reach the groundwater is actually purer as well without those nutrients added.
And is this what is known as, there's this fabled thing called moist, well-drained soil, which is referenced on probably every page of the RHS website where they mention plants and plant requirements. Is that what that is? What you're talking about there, the soil with the organic matter in it?
I'm glad you've brought that up, because that was one of my I've spent years as an amateur gardener thinking, what on earth does moist but well drained soil really mean? And that really bugged me right from the beginning. Was, what does that mean? That doesn't tell me anything. Moist means it's wet, well drained means it's dry. What does that mean? So let me try and explain that one in a slightly better way. When you want roots to grow in your soil, they need water, but they also need oxygen. So like every other living thing, the roots need oxygen to respire. And so you've got to have that balanced mix of water and oxygen in your soil. And to get that, you need those open air spaces. You need the pores in the soil. And what happens is that when you've got healthy soils with lots of invertebrates and things like earthworms and springtails and woodlice and all things running through it, they create those little pore structures. The bacteria themselves that actually live in the soil, they also exude what I call bacterial poo, and it's like a natural swell gel, and it creates a sticky sort of glue that helps to glue the crumbs of the soil together, which then opens the soil up. And when you've got those air spaces, but you've also got all those lovely big surfaces on the soil particles, then the soil particles themselves can be capturing a layer of water, but then you've got those air spaces between them, and then you've got a really great environment for the roots to grow that can get all the water they need and all the oxygen that they need as well.
Perfect. Well, that does clear up something that baffles, I think, probably most people. So thank you for that. And the other thing that is perhaps, potentially was a bit daft, I think about 15 years ago, maybe, there was this big push to get everybody to grow drought-tolerant plants because we were all heading towards this Mediterranean climate due to climate change. And what happened was there was a particularly strong push for maybe a year or two. And then a year after that, we had really awful flooding, and I think everybody lost their plants. So have you looked much into drought-tolerant plants as part of your research? Do you think there's a place for them still in this country?
Yeah, I've not done an awful lot actually directly with plants. I've very much focused on water and water management. So specific plants, no, haven't done a lot with it. But yeah, I quite understand what you're what you're talking about. And it does frustrate me that as soon as you mention, oh, we're going to do something about water and water management, somebody says, oh yeah, we'll do some drought tolerant plants. And I think, no, that's not the answer. So I get very frustrated looking at gardens full of gravel and succulents, thinking the first time you get a really wet winter, you're going to lose the lot. And the first time you get a really hot heat wave, dry spell, then that garden is going to be unbearably hot and uncomfortable for even the people and the plants in it. So drought tolerant plants are not the answer. The clue is in the name. We're having climate change. The climate is changing. We're not changing to a Mediterranean climate. We're changing to something that's probably not been seen anywhere on the planet. It's all different everywhere. We are going to experience the Mediterranean in one season, and we're going to experience, horrendous floods in the next season. And there's no getting away from that. And so what we've got to get is resilient planting, not drought tolerant, not water resistant. We've got to get resilient planting. And that means lots of layers of design ideas, changing the topography in your garden so that when you have these dry spells, you can create some shade. Shade immediately helps to lower the temperature. When you have really, lots of water around, you can change topography so that surface water can be collected and attenuated somewhere, or you can drain it away to somewhere where it can be safely attenuated. So there's lots of ways of thinking about it, and I think you've got to think about extremes, both drought and flood, not just heat waves.
Yeah, so in permaculture, the practitioners often talk about using swales. Have you studied their effectiveness at all, and are they appropriate in a smaller garden?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I live on a very steep sloping garden. The house was actually built on what was a very small quarry. So we have no subsoil at all. We have really steep-sided hill. The garden's been terraced. So it's actually really difficult for me to keep any water here. But what I've done is used swales at the base of each terrace, well, not at the top of the terrace, if you like. So any water that does start to run down the hill is immediately caught at the top of the terrace, so that it then is encouraged to go downwards through the depth of the terrace wall, sort of thing, just inside the wall. So it just helps to slow that rainfall down. It helps to slow down the surface water. And encourage it down into the ground. So that's what we really want, is to encourage the water to get into the ground, to infiltrate through the top layer of the topsoils, and get further down into the ground, where it does less harm for everybody that has to live on the surface. For one thing, it encourages the water to get down towards the groundwater, and that's absolutely where the roots need it anyway. So yeah, I would, swales are great. And it doesn't have to be specifically a swale. It can just be thinking about the levels in your garden and adjusting them so that water is retained better.
And have you done any research into things like hugelkultur beds? So, obviously you have the wood in the ground. The wood supposedly absorbs a lot of water and holds it there. Is there any research on the effectiveness of those?
To be honest, I've actually done very little new research. So I did do some trials in my first year. Unfortunately, with COVID as it was, that put a stop to an awful lot of the practical work, because, there was a time when we couldn't even get into Wisley. We were all working from home. So the research has been pretty limited, but there's an awful lot of research out there that's already published, and all we've done really is gathered it all together in one place. Going back to the hugelkultur, so something very similar that we looked at are the self-watering systems. So where hugelkultur holds onto water underneath the soil by using the wood, and after all, wood is designed to take water up through the xylem. That's what wood is, isn't it? It's lots of little tiny water pipes held within the stem of that tree. And so it holds water really well. And that's the natural way of doing it. But there's lots of containerized systems that are available that actually just have a reservoir in the bottom of them, which then means that there's a wicking system usually, and it can be a bit of capillary matting. It can be the actual soil itself that acts as a wick to then take that water back up into the root zone. And I did look at those in one of my trials, and they worked really well. There's a couple of advantages to them, is that because you're storing the water underground, then it is protected from the surface evaporation. So you do tend to lose quite a bit of water from surface evaporation off the top of the soil. So if you're constantly watering the top of the soil and the surface of the soil is wet, you're always losing water through that evaporation. But soil itself is also very good at capillary action. And by that, it's like if you use a piece of dry kitchen towel to mop up a spill on the work surface, and you put the kitchen towel on the edge of a bit of water, then the water is drawn sideways along the kitchen towel, and that's capillary action. So you can pull water sideways and even upwards by capillary action, and that happens really well in a good quality, healthy soil. And so that's how these systems work. They draw water back into the root zone by capillary action, and that wick can then deliver water as the plants need them. If the plants are not drawing water away from the soil, the soil will remain moist, and that capillary action just won't work. It's not, it's not like a really strong pump. It's a very gentle, slow way of delivering water where it's needed, but keeping that water away from the surface so that it doesn't evaporate.
Thinking about the styles of gardening, obviously we've mentioned two permaculture or traditionally permaculture type systems in a garden. Is there a type of gardening or a style of gardening that particularly lends itself to water-wise gardening?
Well, I don't think there is. I think whatever you do, you can probably do it more sustainably than you currently are doing. I mean, even there's things I can do that would be better. And when I mean sustainably, I mean not just thinking about water, but thinking about all of the things that you do in your garden. If you think about water management in general, then one of the very best places that we store water in the UK is in peatlands. And yet we go and dig them up to put that peat in containers to grow things in our garden, and then use mains water to go and water it. And that's not sustainable. And we need to change some of the things that we do in that respect to be able to make things sustainable. We've all got to do that for everybody's sake. So I think whatever you do, if you're, I'm just trying to think of anything that is particularly water-wise. I don't see that there's any reason that any of us need to stop growing whatever we want to grow, as long as we do it in the most sustainable way that we possibly can.
And thinking about gardens in the wider environment, gardens do make up quite a large land surface area in the UK, and obviously they're an important part of a wider network. Everything that you do in your garden is going to have implications for the wider network. But are there specific things you can do in your garden that do help the area immediately around your garden, and in fact the larger area around you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think if you talk about sustainable gardening, then I think the one thing that we should not be doing is watering our lawns with mains water. So if you think about sprinkling a lawn with mains water, it can use as much water in an hour as you would normally use in your household for a whole week. So that's a whole week's worth of water supply gone on your lawn. For what purpose? Just so that it can look green. There's ways that you can maintain a green lawn without having to use mains water to water it. And it's all about keeping the soil healthy underneath it. It's about getting that right mix of water and air, as I was describing earlier, about keeping the oxygen in the root zone, and hollow tine aerating and doing that in the autumn, so that encourages the autumn rain to get down into that root zone, and that helps the roots grow deeper. And once the roots grow deeper, then they can get access to more water from deeper layers, and that helps the grass then stay greener for longer during a dry spell. And if you've chosen the right variety of grass, then you can get deeper rooted grass varieties that will help to keep that lawn greener. So, even if you do want that pristine green lawn, there's ways of doing it without needing to use mains water. And I think that's what we've got to do, is look for all those ways that don't impact on everybody else. Let's not forget that if we're using mains water, we're taking that water from rivers or groundwater that would otherwise supply rivers. And then there's a whole host of wildlife and aquatic environment that we are then helping to, not maintain as healthy as it could be if we'd left that water in the rivers. So that's what we've got to be doing, is looking for that sustainable way of doing things.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had actually listening to you then. So obviously, as you say, we live in a fairly wet country. What is the problem with us using mains water? Is it just that we're taking it during dry spells, that we're taking it from places that would otherwise need it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've been listening to the news recently, there's an awful lot of public discussion going on about the Environment Bill and water industry and all the rest of it. But on the whole, the water industry is really short of water. So it's not that long ago that there was a complete review of water resources right across England. And the conclusion then was that we are short of water by about 3.5 million litres of water per day in England if we continue to use water the way we do at the moment by 2050. And obviously, because of climate change, we're going to get those dry spells. We do all tend to use more water during dry spells. If you have a really bad flood, then lots of water tends to get used in actually cleaning up those floods. If you have a wildfire like they did on her Saddleworth Moor, you end up using lots of water to put that fire out. So there's lots of sort of compounding aspects to this, added to the fact that, the UK does grow still quite a lot of its food. Think about East Anglia and Lincolnshire. There's an awful lot of potatoes grown over there, and they're irrigated to be able to do that. And it's probably still better for the UK to irrigate potatoes and grow them in the UK than it is to try and import them from somewhere else where they've got even less water resources. And then you've got to transport them into the UK. So we've got choices. We've got to make those choices. Do we want to grow our own food? Do we want to use water to generate hydrogen, which is obviously going to be a much greener fuel as long as we're using green energy to produce it? We've got lots of priorities coming up against us. And so I think everybody would probably agree that actually keeping a pristine green lawn green with mains water compared to growing food, generating power, keeping us all healthy by allowing us the water to wash our hands, we've just got to make those priorities, and we've got to change attitudes to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that most people aren't sitting there just going, oh, well, stuff the water, stuff the environment. And I think most people are concerned. The bottom line, though, is if you've got a lawn, a lot of people have got lawns. I've got an area of it in my garden. I've reduced it from, by about 75%, but still have a small piece. If you want to irrigate your lawn in the summer, and that's the way forward you want to go, you want a green lawn. To me, it seems much easier to plug in a sprinkler, let the sprinkler kind of do its thing, move it a few times around the lawn, and then that's job done. If I want to irrigate it with rainwater, I think probably it's a much more difficult and time-consuming process. And I think that is maybe an issue for a lot of people. They may have had their fingers burnt with previous technologies where, that promised that you could kind of use your grey water, and then they didn't turn out to work. And I think there's just this thing that actually recycling water, conserving water, and using the rainwater that you harvest is actually quite a difficult thing to do. Is that true?
Yeah, I quite agree. Yeah, water's so convenient, isn't it? You just switch the tap on, it turns up every day. You don't have to order it in. You don't even have to pay for it straight away. It's really convenient and it's really easy. But let's not forget, it was originally intended that way because of public health. It's clean water is what keeps us all healthy. not for watering lawns. I totally agree with you that it's so much easier to just put the hose on. But how many people actually measure how much water goes onto their lawn? And even the simplest thing, like, next time you put a sprinkler on, stick a few empty jam jars under your sprinkler and just see where that water goes and how much ends up in your jam jar. When you've got an inch of water in your jam jar, you've got enough water on your lawn and you can switch it off. It's simple things like that would make a difference. If you leave the sprinkler going on overnight because it's convenient and you want to give it a good soaking, you've probably wasted, you leave it on for 12 hours, you've probably wasted 11 hours and 40 minutes worth of water, because it really doesn't need that much. And that's what I think is the difference. It's that it's the excessive use of mains water, because it's so convenient and easy to do, that we've got to get across. And like you say, it's about knowledge. It's about, getting people to understand how much water is really needed. Stick a jam jar out, an inch of water on your lawn. It's not anymore. It's just going to drain away and be wasted anyway.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good advice. And you mentioned, obviously, we're heading to a time of extremes of weather and we don't actually know really what we're in for. Can you elaborate on that? Are there any indications based on previous data, how things like rainfall patterns or the amount of rainfall is going to affect us in the future?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? When you look at some of the floods that we've had this summer across Europe, there's some quite scary news items that have popped up from the flooding point of view. And you think back to the first lockdown, we had a very dry spring. It was lovely and warm. Everybody was out in the garden. Everybody was using the water. And we used horrendous amounts of mains water during that first lockdown. There were places where the water use went up by 70%. And unfortunately, because the system is not designed to do that, that meant that there were some people that actually couldn't get water to their houses because there was so much water being taken out of the system, out of the distribution system, that people that were on the end of the line, the water just wasn't getting to them. So, it's difficult to predict. There are lots of water management plans in place within the water industry. So if you're interested in the detail of that, and if you just look at water resources, for example, there's the National Framework for Water Resources, which was published a few years ago. That's got lots of detail on how they manage the longer term aspects of water resources.
Are there any other resources that you'd like to share with people?
I think the Mains to Rains website is really helpful for gardeners. So what we've done there is tried to incorporate all the really simple retrofit. We don't want people to dig up the whole garden and change the whole thing, but actually retrofitting simple little things, then it can really help. So things like water butts, the obvious choice, keeping your soils healthy by adding compost and mulch. Mulch is really, really helpful because it stops the surface evaporation again. Just choosing the right plants for the right places. So, if you've got a shady, damper spot, ferns, the sort of plants that enjoy those shady areas are going to be much happier. And if you've got sunny areas, then ferns are going to be really upset and unhappy in the sunnier places. So getting the right plant in the right place will mean that you need to use less water. Lawns are the big one, which we've talked about. And even simple things like just placing a saucer under a container. They can make a difference. There's 30 million gardeners in the UK. If everybody's got one saucer under one flower pot, and that flower pot is normally watered through the summer, and you've got that container in a saucer, then actually looking at the sort of the calculations that we've done, you could save enough water to supply 2 million people for a whole day through that summer. So that's, it's small actions that add up because there are so many gardeners in the UK. And that's what makes a difference. So do have a look at Mains to Rains. We're asking people to pledge to make those switches in their garden to help use more rainwater. And as of this morning, because I've just looked this morning again, then we've managed to already identify 10.5 million litres of water per year that could be switched to rainwater. And that's from a relatively small number of gardeners. So the more people that do it, the more we can show the potential that's out there for making use of that rainwater.
A huge thank you to Janet for sharing the findings of her project. Managing water use in the garden is one of the biggest challenges I've faced personally as a professional gardener, and I think we have a long way to go, both from an education and available technology perspective. But it's great that projects such as the Knowledge Transfer Partnership between Cranfield University and the RHS are looking at ways we can do better. Thanks to you for listening. Now up next is Dr. Ian Bedford with his Bug of the Week.
Autumn is the time of year when an important group of invertebrates, the arachnids, become increasingly more noticeable to us, since many species, particularly those with a yearly life cycle, will have become fully grown adults. And the pervasiveness of the most well-known taxonomic group of arachnids within our gardens will be revealed on autumnal mornings by the dew as it glistens on webs and countless layers of silken threads that the spiders trail across the plants and surfaces. But less obvious will be the many species of arachnids that don't produce silk. The ground-dwelling mites, ticks, and in warmer parts of Britain, even scorpions. But also an order of arachnids called the opilions, which are more commonly known to us as the Harvestmen. Harvestmen, of which there's around 25 species in Britain, are relatively common, and although they can be seen throughout the year in a variety of habitats, they're most likely to be found during autumn and around harvest time. But without close inspection, Harvestmen could easily be mistaken for cellar spiders, the daddy long-legged spiders that we often find lurking in dark corners or behind the furniture within our homes. Since just like the cellar spiders, most Harvestmen have 8 long spindly legs and a small round body. But unlike the spiders, they don't have a waist, they don't produce webs, and they're not venomous. They do, however, have 2 eyes on a raised structure on their backs, and 2 large fangs that protrude from their heads, and hooks at the end of their legs that they use to catch their prey, which includes a wide variety of other invertebrates, including spiders, slugs, and even small snails. They also have an effective defence strategy, for which they readily shed a few legs if caught by a predator, and then secrete a foul-smelling liquid to deter them from being eaten. So the Harvestmen are quite a unique and interesting group of invertebrates that often go unnoticed within our gardens, but are well worth keeping an eye open for.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.